A UConn student wanted for murder has been arrested. Police caught Peter Manfredonia in Maryland last night after he was on the run for nearly a week. He is accused of killing 2 people in Connecticut. At a press conference today, though, police said they still don't know the motivation behind the murders. NBC News correspondent Kathy Park joining us now. And Kathy, what other new information do you have from that press conference?
Hey, Allison. So Peter Manfredonia was spotted in Hagerstown, Maryland last night around 9 o'clock. And keep in mind, this was a multi-state effort, multi-agency effort, because he's been on the run, crossing several states over several days. And what was interesting, though, was that investigators were at this pilot truck stop because they received a tip. They were at the scene, and in just a really surprising turn of events, when they were talking about the suspect and his description, they happened to just look around and realize that he was standing right next to them. Take a listen.
The detectives were explaining and talking about the characteristics of Mr. Manfredonia. As they were talking about his height, 6'3", 6'4", one of the team members turned, and approximately 20 feet away from him was a gentleman who was 6'4". Detective Michael Zeller, at that point, who was providing the update, looked over at Mr. Manfredonia and noticed that he had his red sneakers on.
And throughout the manhunt over nearly a week now, officials say that the suspect was armed and dangerous. But when they were able to approach him and basically confront him, they approached him with guns drawn. He didn't resist, and we were told that he was not agitated at the time. They did, however, recover a weapon nearby the scene of the arrest. And right now, we still don't have a motive. Allison?
Kathy, do we have any sense of sort of the time frame here when he might be back in Connecticut, when he might face charges there?
Yeah, the officials, they were pressed about just kind of the legal proceedings, what's going to happen next. They didn't want to talk about the charges at this time. However, they did say that he will likely be extradited in the next week or so. So right now he is being held in Maryland. He had a bond hearing today. So to be continued over the next 2 weeks or so when he's back in Connecticut to face those charges.
All right. Kathy Park, thank you so much.
Sure.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.